Canada control $40 billion in assets. They made $2 billion in grants annually. They run significant charitable programs. They shape their communities. They sometimes shape government policy as well. Should there be more scrutiny associated with that? These are issues that the people in this room know all too well. We're going to have some discussion about it here with our three guests. So let's start here. Narinder, should running a private foundation be like running a gold mine? You want to run a gold mine, you got to get certified, you got to go through all sorts of procedures with government. Should it be the same way?
Well, perhaps not the exact same way, but I do believe that when you're putting the trust of public benefit into private foundations, they need to be accountable. We need collectively to be accountable for the way we drive our impact. So the fact that the filings are limited, the sharing is limited, there's a lot of information that we do not share is a limitation to what we're doing. The fact that most of our assets are not driving impact is a huge challenge. So if we are set out to drive change across Canada, why do 95% of our assets sit in public markets or other types of investments? So we have a challenge on how we've structured private foundations, how we've incentivized private foundations, and then ultimately how we manage private foundations.
Peter, your view.
Well, I think in the future it will be like running a mine. People are not offended by that metaphor, but you're going to need a social license to operate. Now, the system as we have it is one that comes out of the Income Tax Act, and you're regulated by like your financial institutions. You can get off easy saying, okay, I met my disbursement quota, I send in my T3010, I'm done. But the challenge, and there's good reasons, and there's a debate going on in the PFC about whether or not we should move out of that framework of financial regulation and be either more like another charity or that part of us. That's complicated, but it's going to happen that we need a social license to operate. Underlying that is what risk are you willing to take and who are you going to take the risks with? The current regulatory thing severely restricts what risks we can take and with whom we can take them. So yes, a regulatory change, important, but this is actually about, as foundations, we will only ever be as successful as our social partners. End of story. But who do you take risks with and how is the risk shared, I think is the elephant in the room.
Gotcha. Janice?
No.
Thank you and good night. Okay. Yeah.
I actually, and the reason I'm saying no is not because I entirely believe that, because I think that the regulatory regimes we have in this country are perverse and are creating perverse behavior in the foundation community, unfortunately. And I don't have a lot of confidence that we're going to get regulatory change. Let me give you just one example, frankly, which has to do with the way overheads are calculated in foundation and in most foundations, and what we generally consider in polite conversation the acceptable amount of overheads which we can make public in the interests of transparency to show our donors that the funds we raise are going to the people we're raising the funds for. There's a huge issue with that we don't talk about, which is the foundation community in this country does not really seriously invest in its staff. It doesn't, and I hate to say it, but it's true. It doesn't invest in its staff the way the institution that I come from, the university, does. It doesn't invest in its staff the way the private sector does. And there are days, not many, when even the governments, all levels, invest in developing talent. There's no strategy and there's no coherent plan for foundations in this country to recruit, retain, which is what we talk about, the most talented young people from across this country. Regulatory regimes, perversely, discourage that kind of investment in the foundation community. And Peter's nodding his head here, so. When people ask me, should foundations be accountable? Not within the current regulatory regime, no. I think the regime is a poor fit for the purposes that Peter was talking about with respect to foundations.
Well, that may be an argument to move out of the financial thing into a different, whether it's the general nonprofit or the voluntary sector. That's got to be a shift of scene.
We have to have a serious, big think about the accountability framework that would enable foundations to do what you two were just talking about, which is to be accountable in a meaningful way to the people that you work for and work with, right? We don't have that. So hold off. Don't agree to any metrics.
Narinder, do you want to push back on that at all?
Well, no, we also don't have a home for the sector. So the sector spans every sector. So it is difficult to say, and I think we kind of push to the regulatory framework or CRA or that type of structure because there's no other home for us. And so until we have a specific space within, I would say, argue government, we're not going to be able to effectively manage ourselves.
I'm not a big fan of government in this space either, Narinder.
Well, I would agree with you, but I do think they have an important role to play. On the overhead piece, I do think that as a community of foundations, we need to make sure we don't get into that habit of when we look at who we grant to. So overhead, I think everyone in this room will agree, is an arbitrary number. Yeah. You could tell me 10%, I can make sure my organization has 10% overhead. It is meaningless, but we enforce those views into the charitable sector constantly in the way we ask for proposals, in the way we ask for donees to be running their activities. So we are not investing in their capacity, and I think we need to invest in our collective capacity at the same time.
Can I get a sense of the room here? And we're just keeping it inside the hall here, so there's no cameras, don't worry about it. I want to know who agrees with the notion that foundations ought to be run a little bit more like gold mines in as much as you should have to have increased scrutiny, increased certification, and so on. Hands up, please. A few of you. Hands down. How many are completely opposed to that notion? Hands up, please.
That's not the right question, Steve.
This is not the first time Janice Stein has told me I'm not asking the right question.
That's not the right question.
What's the right question?
The right question, how many people think we need an entirely different regulatory framework through which to hold?
Okay.
Okay.
That's the right question.
That's the right question.
And more hands go up in that case. I see. All right. And how about on this? How about on that second thing you said, which was a little bit provocative here, which that your sector doesn't really reinvest in itself and in its people enough? Who agrees with that notion put forward by Janice Stein? Lots of hands up. Hands down. Who disagrees with that? Thinks Janice is out to lunch, as I've been telling her for 25 years on TV. Nobody disagrees with that notion? Interesting. Okay. Well, as a general rule then, maybe Professor Stein is on the outs on this, but as a general rule, do we think foundations ought to be receiving more scrutiny than they currently are?
So I think in a perfect world, we would want to share more, share what doesn't work, so that we continue to take learnings from what doesn't work.
Share with whom?
With all of our stakeholders, which is challenging. Like, how do we prioritize our stakeholders? Is it our beneficiaries? Is it the donors, the board? Is it government? Like, who is the stakeholder? I think there's a question there. But I think if we were to look at this room, just sharing internally, like having shared diligence, having shared lessons, having an ability to understand what initiative that worked in Cape Breton can be could potentially work in Vancouver. Like understanding what works and doesn't work, I feel like there's a big void and vacuum in that conversation.
Does this,
But
go ahead, Peter.
You're calling upon foundations to be more innovative.
Yes.
I believe in that.
Yeah.
But it's one of the paradoxes of innovation economics. If you're going to innovate more, you have to accelerate your rate of failure.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which no one wants to do.
And your board or government agency, that's not the first thing on their list in the morning.
No, and just to elaborate on Peter's point there for a minute, government is really heavy-handed when it regulates. It's really tough. I've never succeeded in going to a government department and saying, this is a really important thing for this country to do. Give me this money. Let me fail 5 times on my way to getting there. it just hasn't worked when I've tried to have that conversation.
No cabinet minister wants to hear that from their deputy.
Nobody has invested. I mean, despite the obvious sense of speaking. Well, that's right. So I'm not, that's why I said I'm not a fan, because government of necessity, that's its role, lags behind. It always has lagged behind. And that's a bad fit, frankly, with this sector. So I think what we're really talking about here is an entirely different role for an organization like this, where we start as other groups in society have, with self-regulation, where we're aware of what makes the sector different so that it doesn't really fit neatly into a space, but through an organization like this and others in the sector, you make space for the kind of regulation that is very, very different from what's in universities, as you know, Peter, for what's in a mining company.
Can you make that argument to government? Can you make the argument that we're different from all these other types of institutions and therefore we ought not to be regulated the same way?
Yeah, and why, I actually think you can. And why is that? Because if you look at some of the professions in this country, they've made that argument, right? Doctors are regulated by their own professional association in their colleges. That's not a model for anybody else. Lawyers are regulated by their functional college, which are legal societies. So there's no reason that you couldn't make an argument like that. But what you'd have to have is a clear and cohesive statement. And that's where I think the real challenge lies. That leadership from private foundations come together with a set of goals and a set of regulatory proposals, which you take out first to your own community and to your staff. Which are I really believe are the neglected voice in this whole conversation.
Let's hear Peter and then Narinder.
But I think we share a problem, though. Let me turn it back on our social partners. One of the disturbing things, we're a founding member of the PFC, so we've seen this whole show. One of the disturbing things in the last 10 or 15 years is the charitable or voluntary sector, whichever language you want to use. 75 or 80% of them, in my observation, have become contractual deliverers of government services.
Yeah.
That has exposed them to a kind of accountability of a bureaucratic kind that has inhibited seriously their abilities to take risks and to innovate.
So not helpful.
If we're going to take risks, good. But we got to find our dancing partners. But that has become, I understand the pragmatic reasons why that may have happened. But you guys, if the social partners are sharing the same problem, because it inhibits a certain kind of regulation, inhibits your ability to innovate or take risks with one another.
Yeah.
Gotcha. But we have to hear from folks.
Accountability is not necessarily a good word. It depends what you pack into that word.
Narinder, you wanted to add?
So I do believe that I agree with you, the opportunity to innovate, we're not seeing that in the sector. I think we talk a lot about the word innovation, social innovation, but when you compare the for-profit sector, in which the top 10 companies today were not there 50 years ago. There was a different set of top 10 companies. In the nonprofit sector, where we're collectively working to innovate, the same big organizations continue to be the same big delivery agencies. So I do think that we have a ways to go in how we access funding, ensuring it's long-term, ensuring that we get that institutional support, that capacity support that we need to enable the growth and the change that we're looking for.
Janice, can I follow up on something you just said, which is when you say we need to redefine what accountability means in this space, are you saying that you want to go...
I could see
what do you like?
You can see Steve's eyebrows.
Well, I'm trying to figure out whether that means you want to go to some institution and say, I want the money, but I don't want any conditions attached to it, and let me do my thing.
Okay, so here's one issue that I've struggled with, and again, it falls on your point, Peter. I don't want to be regulated by the people that fund me. I really don't.
Is that a reasonable request?
Yes.
Because? Okay,
totally reasonable. Totally reasonable. And if you just think about it for a minute, it's a conflict of interest. It really is a conflict of interest. The funder becomes my regulator, which creates a chilling effect in almost any situation like that I know. And one of the things I look at when I look at foundations is that exactly the question Peter asked. How much of your funding is coming from government? The higher the proportion of funding that's coming from government, the less voice you have.
Can we get specific here? Can we get personal here for a second? When you set up the Monk School, is that the way it worked with Peter Monk and with the province of Ontario?
Well, yes, it did work that way. It absolutely did work that way.
Tell
because
us.
I got, I'll be very direct here. We got a grant from the government of Ontario for specific purposes, which were largely capital construction. But when it came to programming, there was no money for programming that came from the government. So yes, they could count how many widgets we used to build the building, but they had no voice in programming. Let's go to the more difficult issue, which is a private donor. And that was an absolute red line. Here's the vision, here's the goals, here's what we want to accomplish, but there's a red line here. How we do it, we are not accountable for.
So give me your money, Peter Monk, and you don't get to say what courses we teach or who we hire?
Give me your money, private donor. And what we are accountable is for producing the results that we talked about together, but not within a quarter, not within 6 months, not within a year even. And by the way, in order to even begin to achieve the results that we promised, we're going to invest massively in hiring great people. And so you will not see a return on investment and that conversation happened. You're not going to see a return on investment in the way you think about it in the mining sector. You're not going to see that for a minimum of 5 years because we have to invest in great people.
Peter, I mean, I see the wheel spinning in your mind. Is that a template for other sectors?
Yes. Yes, it is. And you have to change the conversation.
Okay, let's hear Peter.
Well, one, there is a real issue, a dilemma, if you're a fundraising entity and if you're not. We're a private foundation. We've never had a dollar of government, and we have no interest in it. Now that creates other kinds of accountability issues, but that is a genuine issue in that respect. I think more generally, again, the accountability and risk-taking are absolutely, I mean, that's the most debilitating. I don't think it's just an issue of bureaucracy, but accountabilities and risk-taking are linked in ways that we have to deal with. Our measure isn't 5 years. Our real metric is what's there after the grant's gone.
Right.
How long are your grants?
Usually 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
What's there after the grants? Or did we do capacity building? And that's our our metric is actually after the grant's gone, what do we contribute?
And you have to go back to somebody and say, here's what we did?
It's not always a happy ending.
Not always a happy ending.
No.
Yeah.
What do you think
But
about...
we take risks.
Yeah.
It doesn't always work.
And you know what, if it's always a happy ending, you know,
If it's always a happy ending, you took no risk.
That's right. Okay. I go in and talk to a CEO, and sometimes I start the conversation when it's a bad winter day here. Tell me about your most interesting failure. Right? That's the opener. And then the person sits back in their chair. The not good ones go, we didn't have any failures. You didn't do anything.
Right.
You didn't try anything. You didn't take a single risk if you can't tell me about an interesting failure you had in this last year.
Is it risky to go to a funder and say, I failed?
Yeah.
Fund me anyway.
Yeah. I failed. What we talked about did not work. Here's why we think it did not work. Here's what we've learned. I've done it to Peter.
Go ahead, tell us.
Peter's been a funder of the Monk School when I was the director, and he seeded projects, and I go back to Peter and Margaret, and I'd say, it didn't work. We failed. I'm telling you, I can sense it, I know. We're on the wrong track.
And I'd say, thank you very much, Janice. Now, did we learn anything?
Yeah, that's right. That was our conversation.
So you were okay with, I mean, not okay with, but you understood the reasons for her failure because something was learned.
Yeah.
So it was
We've
okay.
done a lot of work on PTSD in areas of bombings. We're talking about risky environment for Sri Lanka, Israel, Palestine, Northern Ireland, okay? We know about risk.
Right.
And we know about failure. It's part of the business.
Narinder, is that a template, do you think, for the rest of the sector?
No, absolutely. I don't believe that donees believe they can fail. I think they are in a situation where there is a power dynamic there, and they believe that for them to access further future funding, they need to do well. And so until we're transparent about and open about the failures and what we're learning through those failures, there'll always be the stigma against talking about it. And then that relationship of trust isn't built between the donor and the donee.
Let me raise the issue of another tension that I suspect is within the sector, and that is the need to fund what is most needed versus something funders would prefer. How do you resolve all of that? Peter, you want to take that on first?
Well, from the get-go, you're going to, if it's a private foundation, you're going to charter it with certain objects, okay? And so that puts some limits. And the diversity in Canada of these foundations is really important. Some folks do the environment. That's not our thing, but that's, so there's that diversity on the get-go. And the question is, here's a general charter, general direction. You'll always find good ideas out there. But 90% of it's like venture capital. 90% of this is in finding the right partners. If we got that right, we'll be okay.
Narinder, how would you resolve that?
Finding the right partners?
No,
Or
the original premise I put forward.
So well, can I just pivot for
You wanna
one
pick
sec?
on that?
Because I
Okay.
just want to talk about the right partners, because that has been kind of the thesis for the work that we do at the center. Nothing would happen unless we had phenomenal nonprofit partners who are executing and enabling. But for that relationship to work, and I was speaking to Lynn Baptist, who is one of our champions for one of our programs, SNAP. But for that relationship to work, and she was alluding to this, there's this trust that is there, where the organization, SNAP, knows that we will never leave, and our support is continued to get to our shared vision. So the collaboration piece, what my observation has been, is that we talk much more about it than we actually execute on. And so I feel like that's something that we need to amplify in the work for us to be effective.
Janice, I don't know if you've had a situation where you've gone to the university and they've said to you, here's the desperate need we want you to attack, and you've said, well, that's interesting, but I'm not sure we can do that, but here's what we can do and what I want to do.
I think you're identifying a real dilemma, and I'm sure that every funder in this room has faced that. So let me say an unpopular thing. Not that I don't recognize the agony of making these decisions, because there really is. But if you fund only what is desperately needed, the desperation will grow. All right? And that's the best. What do I mean by that, Peter? So what I mean is that some of what you have available obviously has to go, and there's diversity in the sector, thank goodness, as Peter just said, which is critically important, really it is. So some of that will go always to what is desperately needed. But if you are not, and this is my hope for the private foundations of Canada, actually, because I think it's something that just has to happen in this sector. If a group like you is not seriously investing in thinking about the future, and long term, by which I mean 20 years out, what is this country going to look like? What is our society going to look like? You know, Peter and I briefly were talking, we're at the very beginning of the fourth industrial revolution. We're living in revolutionary times, right? And so if we just meet the moment, the desperation of the moment, we're not equipping ourselves to, first of all, act in any preventive way toward the future. I always say those beautiful John Turner paintings that we all love, that have come to the city so often, are paintings of the smog and pollution in London at the beginning of the first industrial revolution, when work changed and people left the countryside and moved in droves to the city and faced epidemics and horrible working conditions and unimaginable poverty. Every time we've gone through an industrial revolution, this is the fourth, that's what's happened. And we are just at the cusp of this one. We have 25 years. Peter is working on a project for the Vatican about the future of work, right? And the future of dignified work. If we're not investing in that kind of work, we're going to be putting Band-Aids on things that are going to continue to erupt with greater and greater force over the next 25 years. So what does that really mean? I want every private foundation in this room to take a marginal percentage of your funding, pool it in an organization like this pick a really talented young staff member or board member that you think is a future leader and start an ongoing program that will not meet at an annual conference once a year, that will meet 6 times a year, that will create a pool of leaders who talk to each other, that will bring really smart people from across the different sectors in to help you think through what's coming at you. Because let me tell you, the private sector is doing that, the public sector is doing that, the universities are doing that, and you're not.
Interesting. Okay. I want to set up a new area for conversation here, and in doing so, tell you about, at the risk of sounding self-promotional, an edition of the agenda that we recently did on TVO, where something very odd happened. There's a fellow named Anand Giridharadas who's written a book basically suggesting the following premise, that many huge corporations are basking in the glow of great publicity because of the giving away of millions of their dollars to very good causes, but their unwillingness, in the view of the author, their unwillingness to pay their fair share of taxes creates some of the problems that their foundations are trying to solve. That's the premise. It was a very sticky show. He actually got up and walked off the show, which I think happened once when you were, it happened once when we did it in the past, but we fortunately were able to talk him into coming back on. But there was a member of the Rockefeller Foundation who said he was absolutely full of crap and went at him, and Anand just got up and left. He came back, but as you can tell, this makes for some uncomfortable discussion. That observation that he's made, Narinder, fair or not?
It's fair.
Accurate?
Yeah. So I don't think it's hard to paint everyone with the same brush. And I was actually watching that episode last night, and there was a conversation on Peter Monk in that, so we should talk about that. But I think the way we've set up power structures results in us maintaining those power structures over time. Philanthropy is another power structure. It's a power structure that contains very similar people who are in the business structure and in power within the business space. And we are then taking that social license of being the social change makers. So what does that mean? And so when I reflect on Anand and his narrative, I think there is value in that. I don't fully agree with him because I think there's Gates and other people who have really done tremendous work. But we do give a tremendous amount of power to those in business. And does that result in a more just society? If you look at the data, no. We have one of the most unequitable societies that has ever existed. So I think it's interesting, difficult to solution around. So the practicality of what do you do with that becomes a challenge, and what I've been thinking through. I don't know if either of you have thoughts on.
Peter, go ahead.
Well, if you take some of the classical things, it would be difficult to fault the Ford Foundation for, its 75-year, 85-year trajectory. It's a relatively new phenomenon where you get, quote, corporate foundations. And the criticism that should be examined is whether or not, in fact, they've cut back in a bunch of their charitable giving and they've been aligned this with their marketing objectives and long-term corporate strategies. That's a legitimate concern. At the end of the day, you can take a poke at private capital, period. But the clear metric for foundations is whether or not they do what they're supposed to do, transfer of private resources to public goods or community interests. That's the central economic. You say that system shouldn't exist, but that's the one at the core of it.
Janice.
So I disagree with that. But let me make the bigger argument that it is very important that people pay taxes and that corporations pay taxes because, and there should not be escape routes from paying taxes because that's how we that's how we redistribute income. And if we bleed our tax system dry, we will just increase inequality. But that's a large issue of tax policy, which our governments have really failed at in a meaningful sense. So let me say that. Let me tell you where I disagree with him. I think to say, and he could be read this way, to say that private business who have contributed to foundations is responsible for social inequality is just nonsense. It's nonsense, frankly. The foundation sector, including Gates and Zuckerberg and everybody else, has the most marginal impact at the margin on social inequality. Social inequality is, and we know what the causes of social inequality, they're global. They were trade, they're globalization, they're technology. Those are the big drivers of social inequality, and they fit very much, by the way, with the argument I was making earlier that a tsunami is going to hit us as we move through this fourth industrial revolution. So for me, and that's where the book is really misdirected. I think what is crucial, though, that maybe we need to think about, and Peter, it'd be interesting to see what you have to say, that only a certain proportion of a very wealthy corporation, only a certain proportion of its assets can go into a foundation, and the rest have to be taxed. And we need much better tax enforcement so companies don't have the capacity to move assets around the globe and travel to tax havens where, frankly, the money's not going into the foundation. It's going nowhere. It's hidden. The final thing that Anand says is governments, it should go to foreign aid. Foreign aid's a disaster. By and large, it's a disaster. Again and again and again, it's a disaster, and I'd rather you folks had that money. I really would. It's a disaster because it's in this highly rigid accountability framework. And I've been on the receiving end of audits. Oh my God, it's indescribable. It's literally indescribable, the mismatch between what we're about and the regulations these poor auditors have to follow when they try to deal with me. It's a nightmare proposition. And when you send auditors out to audit, what they're supposed to audit was this one. Did you see this one in the paper? It blew me away. The funders failed to get enough women into politics in Afghanistan. They didn't meet their targets.
And therefore?
Shouldn't fund these folks, right? Because they didn't meet their benchmarks. They didn't meet their metrics. In the middle of a war, they didn't meet their metrics. So we're having a crazed conversation.
Peter.
I'm the only person on the panel who has had the distinct pleasure of being the chief economist of the government. We need a different kind of tax system. We need a more efficient and effective and equitable tax system.
Yeah.
But to do that on one jurisdiction at a time in a world where capital and technology is so mobile is virtually impossible. Yeah. It's just incremental, incremental moves forward.
And so if we can't have it, would you rather the money go into the foundations or would you rather it go to Panama?
Well, it's going to go to the foundation than to Panama, but those shouldn't be the choices.
But they are. You just said they are because we can't do it in a global world.
Just curious, which government were you chief economist for?
The Ray government.
One with all the fun, Bob Ray.
Okay. Those were great days, weren't they?
I have all the scar tissue in my back. That's right. You want to know about failure?
Actually, people may remember this, 25 years ago last month, you were one of the negotiators for the social contract.
Yes.
And Ray Days and all of that.
And I actually had somebody come up 2 days ago who Ford government is looking at 25% cuts in program funding in Ontario. He says, I wish I had Ray Days. Yeah. I thought I'd croak.
Ray Days meaning unpaid days off work. You keep your job, but you had 10 or 11, whatever, unpaid days off work.
We could have Ray Days or we could have 35,000 layoffs. We made a choice.
It was a measure to reduce inequality. Yeah. That's what it was.
That's my fault. I got us off the path there, but I just thought, and we did a show on it actually last month, and Bob Ray came on and talked about it and sang your praises. And didn't win re-election, but that's the way it goes, yeah. Narinder, you wanted to respond to something that you heard over here.
I did. It was something you mentioned, Janice. So I do believe that we are missing social audits. social impact audits in our work. So I believe that we need to trust the people we fund and enable with that support, but we need to have a way to understand if the work we're doing is actually driving that impact. So there is this huge gap. And this is where, unless we collectively work together, and there are spaces that are doing that better than we are. So impact investing is a newer space, and they're relying on a number of terms, IRIS and a few other types of metrics. Like, we collectively haven't come together and said, this is how we think good should be measured, and let's make it easier on everyone who's delivering, and let's just align.
Sorry, one of the things I really worry about here, and I'm sure there are foundations in this room, that meeting the audit requirements and the accountability requirements takes up 40% of your time. And some are smaller ones, 40% of your staff, right? And so that's a defeating system. But to understand within a reasonable period of time, and again, we need to stretch it out. You know, I know private sector leaders who are taking their companies private in order to get out of the trap of reporting every quarter, because it's distorting their capacity to have long-term objectives. In this sector, when we demand annual reports like this and ask the question, did we have an impact in a year? To take this ludicrous one, how many women did we get involved in politics in Afghanistan in a year? It's preposterous, frankly. So what has to change? It's not that there doesn't have to be an impact analysis, but it has to be done in an entirely different way, and I argue with a much longer timeline than we're currently using. And we have to get out of the face of people in that intervening period. You know, we can't design a system for cheaters. We just can't. And so I'm actually prepared to have the occasional cheater. It's better than perverting the whole system, designing a system to catch a cheater when that cheater is 1 out of 100. And so much of the regulatory mechanisms and the audit mechanisms and even the social impact mechanisms are all designed to get the person that's functionally cheating.
But that's an incorrect design. In the proper design of impact. In a proper impact assessment, you're understanding the value that's being created at the beneficiary level. And if it's done effectively with the beneficiary, you can drive great results and impactful results that can be fed in. I agree that we do it wrong collectively.
Why can't we talk about partnering?
Sorry?
Why can't we talk about partnering?
Knock yourself out, kid. What do you want to do?
I mean, again, you hear the difference in the language, though? If you're a donor and a funder and you say, we're your partner, we're here for you. We've agreed on a shared goal. This is tough, what you're trying to do. This is really hard. And your idea is really interesting, but we don't know if it's going to work or not. Keep us in the loop. Talk to us all the time. We want to learn from you. And we might bring other people to the table that have tried this, and they may be of interest to you. So we're going to have an ongoing conversation for 3 to 5 years about this, and then together we'll assess whether you met your objectives or not and whether you drove impact. That's just an entirely different conversation than the one we're having.
Can I follow up, though, Peter, with you on something Janice said, I think, a couple of answers ago, which is that, I mean, clearly there are large corporations that spend a lot of money hiring the best lawyers and the best accountants to make sure that they can not evade, but avoid paying as much tax as they legally have to. I think you have to be president of the United States to evade taxes, but apparently to avoid paying taxes. Should we be blaming companies for doing that, or the politicians who apparently have written the tax code to allow them to do it?
Well, I mean, the Parliament of Canada passes laws, and it's a sometimes thankless task of the CRA to enforce those. So I don't have a big squabble with the CRA, even though from time to time, like any large bureaucracy, they do something wonky. I think the reality, though, if you're in a position of authority at a foundation and you know something about this business, we are in Canada relatively light touch regulated compared to our cousins to the south, who have to do activity, accountability stuff wildly beyond where we are. So now there are reasons for us to move out of that, simple, make your, satisfy the proportion you have to donate and get your T3010 is. But we are actually have a light, I think we have a light touch but ineffective system. That's where it comes to.
Okay. I'm just checking. Okay, we've got a few minutes left to go here, and I want to put one more issue on the table for everybody to discuss, and let's just go down the line and get your thoughts on that. Diversity among decision makers in the institutional philanthropy sector. How are we doing? Start.
We're trailing the private sector substantially. I think it goes back to that intentionality. If there's a social psychologist at NYU who talks about being a good person. And so, most of us believe that we are good people. And anytime you think about things in the binary, you're either a good person or a bad person, it prevents you from growth. And so her view is that we should embrace this view of goodish, so that when we're absorbing critical feedback, we can say, okay, maybe there is a diversity gap in my leadership, but I'm in this journey of being goodish. It's not saying that I'm a bad person because my teams aren't representative of the clients that we serve, but it's saying that I'm on this journey and there's more that I can learn. So I would say that we are not there, and if we maintain a growth mindset, that we can get there and realize that we need to be open to that fact that there is a gap in diversity. I see it usually as the only woman of color in a room, as the only engineer in a room, as probably the shortest person in the room. But there is a gap. Oh, okay, actually no, Janice beats me on that. But there is a gap. There's a gap there, and I think we can take a lot from the private sector that has this extreme intentionality of being more diverse, and are actually, because they're measuring it, acting on it and managing it.
Can I just be clear? Are you saying that the sector is not even good-ish yet?
No. I think we're on a journey we're good-ish. We're on our journey of goodness.
Got it.
And so...
Good-ish, but not yet good.
Well, we could be better.
Could be better.
We can always be better.
Yep.
So.
Peter.
I agree with those policy goals, but I would actually personalize. I actually prefer Pope Francis's metric. Do I actually, if I'm a trustee, do I actually have any friends who are poor? Do I actually have any friends who are Native people? So I wouldn't, yes, there's the regulatory and policy stuff, but look in the mirror. Do I actually have any friends who are poor?
Do you worry that sounds a bit like some of my best friends are ...
No. ... You can try and kiss it off that way, but ask your friends. You have actually, we talk about these redistributive objectives, got all that. But actually, look yourself in the mirror as personal accountability. Do I actually have any friends who are poor?
And if you can't answer yes, what does that
Go find
suggest?
some.
Yeah, it means that you're siloed, right? Yeah. That's what Peter's trying to say, that you're really not moving out of your own comfort zone very much. And if you're not moving out of your own comfort zone very much, it's hard to understand where somebody else is. So, we in the university struggle with these same issues, Narinder, all the time. And we're never good enough, frankly. And we're never good enough for a really good reason. And that good reason is that our country is one of the most welcoming countries in the world, thank goodness. And the people that we serve in the university are always more diverse than our faculty, because the student body coming in is coming in as the first generation children of people. 40% of our students at a big university like University of Toronto are children of people who were not born in this country. So there's always a lag. We're never going to be good enough. But how do we do this in an intentional way? And I think the foundation sector can move at a much more rapid pace if it expands its notion of diversity. Diversity is not only diversity on boards. Diversity is also diversity in staff, right? And again, if we think about this sector's investment in talent, in recruiting, in developing talent for the future, and that's part of us. That's not them. That's part of us. it is not hard to find absolutely wonderful people from diverse backgrounds in virtually every big city in this country. It's harder sometimes in the rural areas, but it's not hard in the city. And here's what the private sector has learned, that paradoxically, this sector has not really internalized it quite the same way. Diverse groups make better decisions. They just do. I can tell you that. They do. So your programming decisions, your vision decisions, your, oh my God, what's the world going to look like in 25 years, that kind of thing that I've been talking about will just be enormously enriched if you have staff that are diverse and that bring different world experiences and different backgrounds and different religious traditions to the table.
Well, the question is how you get there. Narinder, how do you get
It's not hard.
So Marc-André Blanchard, who I think many of you would know, our ambassador to the UN, says something I think very he talks about the solution for this. We need to give access to opportunity, and we need to trust people who don't look like us. And he told me this. He was one of our advisors, was one of our advisors before he left for the UN. And we were talking about diversity in the law system, and the partners tend not to be diverse. And what he was encouraging his team to do is give those interesting cases, those high-stake cases, those opportunities that people can use to shine to people you wouldn't necessarily trust inherently because they don't look like you, they don't act like you, they might not go to the same country club as you. Like, how do you break that? They might not think like you. But that's it. Like, one of the challenges why you don't see diversity move up is because diverse people aren't given the opportunity to shine. And so I think we just need, and everyone can do that. Everyone can say who is on my team, who is on the front line that has potential, and how do I give them that opportunity, that side project, that extra project, or that main project that will let their skill set show.
But I am going to follow up with that question about how you get there from here, which is like the previous government of Ontario under Kathleen Wynne decided that women ought to have a larger percentage of positions on boards, for example, in the province, and they didn't, they didn't specifically regulate it to the extent that you had to do it, but you had to have some targets, and if you couldn't hit them, you had to explain why. Yeah. Do we need that in this sector? You want to go that far?
I think what you measure, you manage. And so if we continue to say that we're going to do it because we are good people doing good work, we'll potentially see the same progress we have in the last 20 years.
Steve, what about every foundation agreeing that it will internally, in its own board, set a target for hiring diverse staff in the next year or two?
And if you don't make the target, then what?
Well, then then you're not looking in the right places for great young people. That's all I can tell you, because they're here in this country.
And we do need to build that talent, because young talent needs to be cultivated, needs to be invested in, needs to be supported, so that they can be, in 10, 15 years, leading the next generation of nonprofits or for-profits.
So that's what we call norm setting. I'm not a big believer in letting the government into this business. I don't think it actually helps. But there is a role, again, for PFC to set some norms, right? And then to have conversations. And PFC has been working on this issue. I know you've been working on this issue, Hillary. So, and that's part of how this goes. But take back your own boards. What's our target next year? Are we going to hire anybody? Well, who are we going to hire so that we can get a diversity of thinking in this room as we think about what we're going to do next?
Peter, you got some thoughts on how we get there from here?
I think, one, lots of different kinds of foundations, and their staffing levels go from 0 to many. The other thing is think about the beneficiaries of your projects. I don't have an exact count, but 90% of the beneficiaries of the projects we're running are not white. Some of them are Syrians, some of them are Chinese, some of them are all kinds of folks.
Good. I am mindful of making sure that we stop on time here. So can I ask each of the three of you, it's a bit of a cliche, but it usually works, can you leave us with one thought, one parting thought about what you'd like everybody to go home with? Narinder, go ahead.
Don't focus on being a good person. Focus on being a good-ish person, and start that spectrum of growth.
Peter.
I think take advantage of one unique thing that private foundations can do. You can decide there's a domain, an issue or something, and you can stick with that until you have an impact after CNN has gone away or CBC has gone away or whatever. But you can do that and have large impacts.
Janice.
I have an annual conference next year in which 4 working groups report in on the work that they did during this year from 2018 to 2019, which represent, and all of you are involved in that in some way, in which we think about how Canada makes this journey through this 4th industrial revolution and what it's going to do to our society.
I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative